So for our last talk of the conference, I wanted to give you something a little bit different. If you made it to Ignite Portland 9, which was, what, 6-ish months ago? Longer than that?
No, the one that I spoke at.
Yeah.
That was like 2 years.
Oh, 2 years ago. I'm sorry. You leave town and you stop paying attention to how many Ignites there have been. Anyway, if you made it to Ignite Portland 9, you've seen a shorter version of this talk. Carl Alvioni is here to talk about the history of plastic in product design. So, Carl?
All right. So, am I mic'd? I am mic'd. Okay, there we go. So, as you guys have probably gathered already, I'm not a Ruby developer. I don't actually know the first thing about it. My undergrad long ago was actually in structural engineering, so I dabbled a little bit with coding there, and that's about the extent of it. And the reason I'm going to give you a little bit of my personal background is to understand kind of where this whole topic comes from in the first place. I went from an engineering degree to becoming a science teacher to becoming an industrial designer, and now I am a writer, and I write about industrial design. And in 2007 or so, I had recently moved to Portland and was still working for an industrial design online magazine called Core 77, which, if you're an industrial designer, that's kind of like, that's the place where you go to chat with other designers, to learn about new trends in manufacturing and materials and who's designing what cool stuff. And as I was chatting with my editor, we were looking for an idea for a new feature article. And I got into this anecdote. And I'm going to start with this anecdote here, and I'll show you where it goes from. So one of the things that you have to do when you learn industrial design is you have to learn a little bit of photography, and like proper photography. You have to get an SLR. You have to learn how to set up softboxes, and it's mostly so that you can document your process and you can document the models that you've made and so on. And so this is kind of a rite of passage, which is everybody at some point or another goes to a photo store. This was in New York City. So I went to Adorama, which is this sort of legendary photo store in Lower Manhattan near Union Square. And I was like, I'm here to buy my first SLR. This was kind of when digital was still fairly exotic. This was 2001. And so the guy reaches down and he plops down 2 cameras right in front of me. And he says, OK, this one, the Pentax K1000, solid metal body. You can drop it. It's probably been resold 15 times. It's still in great shape. It'll last another 20 years. I was like, great. He's like, this one over here, the Pentax ZXM, same internals, same guts, everything. Polycarbonate body, you drop it, it's gone. And what he was doing was he was presenting me with this decision between the real material and the cheap plastic substitute. And cheap plastic substitute is just like, it's a phrase that rolls right off the tongue. And this was fairly early on in grad school for me. I was still kind of learning the basics of industrial design. I was still learning about materials science. So I just barely knew, like, there's that, which is the real thing, and then there's that, which is this sort of scary synthetic substitute for it. Not knowing too much more beyond that, and having him say, you drop it, it's gone, I decided, well, I'm serious about this. I'm going to get the real thing, right? Now, if I had actually gone maybe a year later, I might have said, oh, polycarbonate. Polycarbonate, that's an engineering polymer, not a commodity polymer. Polycarbonate has one of the highest toughnesses of any polymer out there. In fact, its strength-to-weight ratio is higher than some steels. Polycarbonate is what makes bulletproof glass bulletproof, right? It is a pretty badass polymer. But this didn't enter into my mind. So that was the decision. Done. Pretty straightforward. And this assumption that the plastic version is the cheap substitute has been pretty consistent since sometime in the late 70s would be my guess when it kind of started to switch over. And there are some reasons for this. It's not accidental, and it's not actually inherent to plastic why we see them as cheap substitutes. It's actually a very intentional result of design decisions that people have been making for decades now. Because if you get right down to it, if you knew nothing about any of these materials and you looked at them right from the get-go, you would realize that a lot of polymers and composites are actually selected very, very intentionally for their properties. They have a lot of other uses besides just making something less expensive to produce. In some cases, they make something more expensive to produce because of the advantage they offer, case in point. So this is the Dreamliner. It is the most efficient mass market passenger aircraft ever made, hands down. And it is 60% plastics and composites. That is why it is so efficient, because the plastics and composites, there are so many thousands of different kinds of them out there that you can select them. You can select exactly the right one that has exactly the properties that you're looking for. And it almost always is going to get you a reduction in weight for its ability to perform a similar task. It's also, the manufacturing methods for polymers are quite different. So if you're using a lot of more traditional materials, like metals or woods or stone or whatever else you name, you're frequently using subtractive construction methods, right? You are carving them, you're hacking them, you're drilling them, you're whatever. When you are designing something out of polymers, you are almost always molding them. There are a bunch of different kinds, blow molding, injection molding, and so on. But what it means is you are sitting down and you are making a shape that has the exact minimum of material that's necessary to do the job that you need. And this is why if you take, for example, a piece of consumer electronics that's been injection molded and you open it up, you'll see a very thin shell and it'll have ribs. And what they're doing is they're making the thing as thin as they can to minimize materials usage, and then they're putting in just as many ribs as they need to strengthen it on the inside. You won't generally see that in something that's made out of metal, for example, because getting that level of precision and that thinness is actually quite difficult. So it's a lot more efficient use of material. Generally speaking, right, this kayak is going to weigh 1/10 what that dugout is going to weigh, for example. And what this means is things that have been designed using polymers could frequently be construed as actually more environmentally friendly. It gets even more so if you start looking at the recyclability. Depending on the way that it is manufactured, something that's made of polymer is actually the most recyclable product you could possibly get. So all three of these are recyclable materials. When you recycle a glass bottle, though, you have to crush it, you have to raise it to several thousand degrees in order to melt it back down if you want to then make a new virgin glass bottle. So you only save about 34% of the energy over making one virgin. Not quite so bad if you're talking about paper. The pulping process uses about 40% of the energy as making something from scratch. Whereas if you recycle a PET resin bottle, which is what your typical soda bottle is, that's 90% more efficient than making one from scratch. So, and if they're chosen correctly, something like PET resin can actually be recycled more or less indefinitely without any degradation in quality because it's designed to be that way. So that raises kind of a question: where did the negative connotations come from? One of them is that a lot of polymers are made out of petroleum, although that's dropping. So you guys are probably aware that there are a lot of polymers out there now that can be made from vegetable sources. This is becoming increasingly economically viable. But there's a couple of other things to point out. The first is that crude oil, like what comes off a platform here, is actually declining in terms of how much it's used for making polymers. Increasingly, it's natural gas, which is about 10 times more abundant. The second is that all of the plastics and polymers in the world that are produced only account for between 2 and 4% of the total amount of fossil fuels. That they pale in comparison to what we use to move stuff around. And if you, in fact, do an overarching analysis of kind of embodied energy of something that is manufactured and then has to be moved from one place to another, or in the case of that Dreamliner, has to move itself, in the long term, you're actually talking about usually using less petroleum rather than more. So my argument is that the real problem is a problem of recognition and differentiation. And I had this hypothesis that I called up a friend of mine. This was a couple of years ago, my friend Allie. She's a high school teacher. And I said, okay, you have 1 minute. I want you to name as many kinds of wood as you can, go. And that's what she came up with, which is pretty good. And then I said, okay, now you have 1 minute, name all the metals that you can come up with. And she said, go. And I said, okay, now you have 1 minute, name all the plastics. She literally could not name a single plastic. And after a minute of her just going, I kind of, vinyl? And she was like, oh. And I was like, plexiglass, nylon, Teflon? She was like, those are plastics? So this is part of the problem, is we have this concept of plastics as this large differentiated body of materials rather than basically every other material that's out there where we have a much clearer understanding of the distinctions between them. So what you have on the left is a mahogany dining set. It is made of mahogany. And if you go and buy it, it's got a little tag hanging on that says made of mahogany. And it might tell you what country the mahogany is from. That is a plastic glass, right? That's actually acrylic. Like, that's a very well-made, very durable acrylic wine glass. But basically no one who buys it is going to know that. And what's interesting is it wasn't always that way. Now, there's certain associations with plastics as substitute materials, primarily because that's what they started life as. So if you go all the way back to the very first polymer ever made, this was 1862, Parkesine was developed as a synthetic substitute for ivory, specifically because we were running out of elephants. And they realized that if they could come up with a synthetic ivory that you wouldn't have to spend, first of all, huge amounts of money to then go and decimate the elephant population. 1894, the first synthetic fiber was rayon, which was specifically designed as a substitute for silk. 1909, Bakelite, which some of you might be familiar with, was actually a synthetic substitute for shellac, which is actually an excretion of the lac beetle, which came with its own difficulties of extraction. So there was a reasoning for that. But while Parkesine basically kind of had it had maybe a 20-year run or so before they came up with a better version of it, rayon has never really advanced beyond kind of like what cheap party dresses are made out of, or wrinkles really easily. Bakelite, though, kind of turned a corner. The history of Bakelite in 20s and 30s America is fascinating. So that's a phone that's made out of Bakelite, and this is kind of a design icon. And it's not the only one. In the 20s and 30s, if you go back to newspapers from that era and you look at catalogs and so on, Bakelite is a material, it's a phenolic resin that is identified by name. And you will even see 100% pure, genuine Bakelite. Like, that's a thing. And people would actually pay extra to have something that was made out of that rather than made out of wood, especially when you're talking about any kind of electrical device. Electrical devices and appliances in the 20s and 30s were a very new thing. Bakelite had extremely good electrical resistance. And so one of the many things that it was used to make were all of these newfangled appliances like telephones and vacuum cleaners and electric irons and so on. It was also used to make things like, pencil sharpeners and boxes and so on. But if you take a look specifically at the 20s and 30s, these electrical appliances, they embody this complete new aesthetic. They don't look like anything else that came at the time. And actually a lot of the great icons of Art Deco product design from that era are made of Bakelite. And a big part of the reason was they didn't have a model to build on. No one had really made telephones before. There was that brief period of time where they were making very early telephones out of like wooden boxes, but those weren't widely available. The idea of a telephone that's just a middle-class person could go to the store, buy, and set up at home was a very new idea in the 1920s, and they didn't know what they looked like. And so industrial designers of that era suddenly had a new purpose to fill. They had a new material to fill it, and also they had a new method for making it, because you don't take 4 pieces of Bakelite and screw them together like you would if you were making a wooden box. You make a mold, and you compress this powder into it, and you raise it to high heat, and when you pop it out, a phone comes out. And so suddenly you can make the thing any shape you want. And because they weren't trying to imitate anything, they made this. And this is beautiful. I mean, and there was a period in the 30s or so when these phones were called Bakelite phones. Like, that was actually the common parlance for them. And all of this despite the fact that in modern understanding, Bakelite is actually kind of not a very good resin. It's very heavy, it's kind of brittle. If you hit it really hard, it'll craze. It gets these little white cracks in it. And it's also completely non-recyclable. It's a thermoset rather than a thermoplastic, so you can't melt it down, it'll burn. And yet, that didn't stop people from loving it so much that they started making jewelry out of it. And these are collector's items. So, so then you fast forward maybe another 10 years or so, and things start to change pretty dramatically, because in the 20s and most of the 30s, there still aren't a lot of synthetics out there. Rayon, Bakelite are kind of the two big ones. There's a couple others that are less common. But then in the 30s, you start seeing this big advancement, and they're starting to roll out new kinds of materials almost yearly. PVC and acrylic, polyethylene and nylon, PET and ABS. And all of these are, almost all of these, if you look at their history, they start off as, oh, this was developed as a substitute for whatever. So like if you look at ABS, that was developed as a substitute for rubber. Nylon was developed as a substitute for manila or sisal or jute. They needed something that wasn't going to rot. And a lot of this was accelerated by the fact that World War was starting to spread. And the effect that this ends up happening on post-war Europe and especially America is that you have this kind of newly affluent middle class in the United States. You've got this baby boom. You've got a bunch of people who are coming to expect a level of access to what had traditionally been luxury goods that had never existed before. And you had all of these companies who suddenly had an incredibly expanded array of materials out of which to make them. And you put all of that together, and what you end up with is this explosion of imitative goods. Now, there are some exceptions to that. And right now, the exception to imitation, probably the best example of it is silicone. So if you're into cooking at all, and there have been a number of articles about this, silicone is actually specifically sought after by name. There was a 2007 article in the New York Times where they actually just did a roundup of silicone goods for the kitchen, in what circumstances they're better. I mean, they have tremendous nonstick properties. They're extremely durable. They can resist temperatures up to 450 degrees or so, but only if they're real silicone. And the article actually had a paragraph or two that said, here's how you tell the difference between real silicone and fake silicone. Basically, you take it and you bend it, and if you start seeing a little white crazing, then you know it's got fillers in it. If you bend it and it gives you no visible change, then you know it's real silicone. So accept no substitute. And this was kind of surprising to me. I had never seen this kind of differentiation before. The Livestrong bracelet, I think, is a really interesting example because it's pure silicone, it's unadorned, it's unpainted, and yet people were still wearing it kind of as if it were a piece of jewelry. And I think a lot of this comes down to this certain rugged, outdoorsy sporting association that we have with the particular feel of silicone. It's a very common material in any kind of water sports because it's very easy to form seals. It breaks down very, very slowly in sunlight, et cetera. And also, like if you've ever read any reviews of sex toys, they talk a lot about how silicone is vastly superior to anything out there in terms of its ability to go through the wash. It's very hypoallergenic, et cetera. So this is one of the exceptions to the rule. Unfortunately, silicone, just like Bakelite, is a thermoset. It's not a thermoplastic, so it fits in that number 7 category, other, completely non-recyclable. So the other exception here is furniture. And is this what I had next? I'm going to go back here. There. Okay, so this chair in the background. You guys have all seen this chair before, right? Okay, so this is Werner Panton's kind of classic Swan Chair, he called it. Or they had a couple of different names depending on who you asked. But there was this clutch of designers in the 1960s who started looking at plastics not as a substitute, because there were already, some of the very early plastic chairs were basically designed to look exactly like wooden ones, and you guys have still seen those. They call them monoblock chairs, the really light, cheap ones you can get for like 20 bucks at Fred Meyer that everyone has in their backyard. That was one path. The other path was saying, if we're molding them, then we can make them look different. So this is made out of ABS. It's really quite beautiful. And in the 1960s, 67 is when this came out, there was a real understanding that this plastic chair was not the same as that plastic chair. There was this kind of infatuation with the space age and the new. And so if you could come up with a plastic product that actually took advantage of the material's capabilities, you would have a built-in kind of audience. So there's a couple of other good examples out there. This is cellulosic acetate. This is what most handles of screwdrivers are made. I kind of love this because it's unpainted and unadorned, and it actually does get scratched up, but you don't seem to mind. You know, this is, and part of the reason is they've been making screwdriver handles out of cellulose acetate for like 60 years or something. And so if you grow up with the thing kind of scratching and buffing out, you just understand that that's a characteristic of the material, and you don't fault it for being that way, and that makes it more okay. Whereas if you contrast this with, for example, the dashboard inside of a car, which is generally ABS, but then it's painted or skinned in some way, and if you scratch it one time, it's like the value of your car just dropped $1,000, right? And this is kind of this is what I'm pointing at as the real issue, is a huge fraction of the applications that we use polymers for are, we're still insisting on pretending that they're a different thing. And this has some really big problems. This is the main one. So this was, when I wrote this article in 2007, I still had a digital camera that was not part of my phone. And this was it, it's a power shot. And so I don't know if you can tell, but this bit right here is metal. This is a very thin metal sheet that's been formed to make a faceplate. But the body of it, and that part that you're wrapping your hand around right there, that's ABS. And it's metal up there. And so what they did is they painted the ABS, which is actually this kind of milky white color, to look like the metal. So it looks like it's all one material. And you can immediately spot the problem with that. If you scratch the metal, it's metal scratching, which we're all fine with. If you scratch the ABS, you're rubbing off the paint and you're exposing the fakery underneath. And it looks basically ready to throw out at this point. This is a habit that is making us throw things away. The other issue is we're refusing to celebrate those materials. So this is the iPod. It's a beautiful thing. It's not just in terms of its physical design, but also its materials selection. That face, it's a thick, heavy acrylic. It's what's called double shot mold, which means that it's actually shot in 2 layers. The bottom is a very thin black layer, and then it's got a thick clear layer over the top, and that's what gives it its beautiful depth. It's what makes it like a rich, kind of valuable object, despite the fact that it's made of plastic. But if you go onto the website, or if you went onto Apple's website and read the literature about it, they would tell you all kinds of other pieces of information. They will never say acrylic, plastic, or anything. There's no attention given to that at all, despite the fact that I would say it's a sizable component of its visual appeal. And actually, its tactile appeal as well. It's got a certain density and smoothness that you wouldn't get with anything other than acrylic. Contrast that with the Nano, right? And it's right here. The smooth anodized aluminum design makes iPod Nano feel as good as it sounds. So again, we're celebrating the one material and really, really ignoring the other one. And there's really just not a great reason for that. So where does that take us? We're going to be having more polymers in the future, not less. That's basically unavoidable. I mean, not necessarily more in terms of overall volume, but more in terms of the fraction that we're making things out of, simply because efficiencies are requiring it. If you want to use less fossil fuels to move things around, polymers is generally the best way to do that. If you want to make bridges lighter so you can build them faster and drop them into place, then you're using composites and plastics to do that, and so on. So ideally, to my mind, what this means is we get more comfortable with a polymer as something that announces itself kind of unapologetically. And so these are 2 examples that I think are pretty good. I think the Honda Element is a pretty ugly car, but it does have these panels right here. And part of the reason, so these are molded polypropylene panels. And if you actually go to the initial press releases when they first unveiled this car, they actually specifically say, like, this is a car, it's designed for, like, your dog, your outdoor gear. We expect you're going to be leaning skis and bikes and so on against it. That's why we put these plastic panels on here, so you can lean them up against it, and it's going to be resilient, and it's not going to scratch up your paint job because it's not painted. They're also relatively easy to remove. You can buy new ones, and you can, like, screw them back into place. So this thing is kind of designed to be modular. And they don't talk about it, but that's pure unfilled polypropylene, which is totally recyclable. And all you have to do is pop the thing off. There's no other material in there. Now, contrast that with the iPod. You will never, ever get the acrylic apart from the rest of the parts. So the thing is basically landfill as soon as you stop using it. So I find this to be a very kind of optimistic use of the material. This one over on the right is called the Emeco 111 chair. I have 2 of these because I think they're beautiful. And this is very imitative. This is exactly the same shape as Emeco's classic Navy chair that they used on submarines for a really long time, which was made out of aluminum and cost $600. This is the exact same shape. It's also quite comfortable. It's also super durable. It's made out of 111 recycled soda bottles. So that is pure PET resin. And you can bang that on the floor all day long and it will not yield. And also it won't scratch because it's not painted. Like, that is red because it's red all the way through, which I think is pretty great. So, so that's basically the end of it. I'm going to wrap this up with, I was racking my brain trying to figure out, like, how is this applicable to kind of the world of development in the world of electronics? And to my mind, there is one very important similarity, which is knowing what's under the hood matters. And I think one of the kind of optimistic things about the growing tendency, you're getting a lot more people who are learning how to code, even if it's extremely badly. You're getting a lot of people who are like running their own Tumblrs or building their own WordPress sites or whatever. And I'm not saying that this is going to result in a renaissance of creativity, but it does allow people to appreciate the reasons behind things, to value the difference between when it's done well and when it's not done well, and also to treat things as less disposable. So in terms of polymers, treating things as less disposable is basically a matter of being able to identify what they are, being able to separate them out, and valuing them for having been selected for what they are. And it's altogether, when we talk about digital literacy, this is an example of what I would call materials literacy, which I think, especially in a time of dwindling resources, is something that's becoming eventually a requisite. So if you're interested in reading the original version, the article that this came from is pretty long. It's on core77.com. I could give you the URL, or I could just tell you it's called Not Created Equal. And if you want to see the Ignite talk, I think I'm probably the only Alvioni in history to do an Ignite talk, so if you just do that search, then you'll find it. So, and that is it. I'll be around for a few minutes if you guys have any questions, but thank you for your time.